Hello, good afternoon. My name is Dan Mihalopoulos, and I'm a journalist at the newspaper called the Chicago Sun-Times, one of the two daily newspapers in Chicago, one of the few cities in the United States, actually, that still has more than one daily newspaper that has a competitive environment. I've worked at both of those papers, first at the Chicago Tribune for about 10 years, and then at the Chicago Sun-Times for about 6 years. It's my immense pleasure and honor to be here with all of you because I have met with groups from the school in Chicago, and I guess many of you will be visiting us in the U.S., and I hope to meet with you in Chicago in the fall. It's usually in November, and that's always just a wonderful experience for me and hopefully for all of our visitors from Russia as well. We have a longstanding relationship with Mr. Signorino, who I can consider a friend now, was actually someone that I wrote about in the beginning of my career more than 20 years ago in St. Louis. And we can talk about that situation later if you're interested. It's quite an interesting evolution. But I was asked to come here and provide my perspective as a local news reporter on the phenomenon of fake news, which, as you know, has become, within a couple of years, this buzzword in, especially in American political debate, but internationally, a word that is, I think, overused, so much so that among the words that were banned for the new year, we have a list here. I'm showing, whoops, why doesn't that, there it is, whoops, too far. There's actually something in the United States called Lake Superior State University in the northern reaches of Michigan, and it has an annual list, and it's 43rd year, the list of words banished from the Queen's English. That's ironic considering where we are, for misuse, overuse, and general uselessness. And I apologize to the translators because that's a tough one, but I think it's up to their capabilities to explain how fake news has become such a common word that people are annoyed by it to an extent. Now let's look here. So we talk about the definition of fake news, and of course there's the sort of fake news that allegedly is manufactured at the behest of certain governments, perhaps, and that is circulated through social media, by bots, and by people who authentically believe those things that are purposefully fake and that are produced to reach an audience that wants to hear what it wants to hear. But we have also, beyond the definition of fake news, other definitions here. Let me find it. Whoops. One of the definitions that I found most interesting here, of course, this story had to be illustrated with only one man's face. You know, as the Telegraph here in England put it, fake news was not a term many people used 18 months ago, but it is now seen as one of the greatest threats to democracy, free debate, and the Western order. Is that an exaggeration? Let's talk about that. It was named at the opposite extreme as a word of the year by Collins Dictionary. And what is the definition of it here? Well, we have a definition that's defined as a phrase that has been leveled against entirely fabricated reporting, as we discussed already, stories that contain errors, simply, and those with a critical tone, and that it's being used deliberately to paint certain stories as being not true. And in my experience as a local news reporter, what I'm starting to find is that fake news, as the political landscape in the United States becomes increasingly polarized, the term fake news is simply being used by anybody who disagrees with what's being reported. And this is true of the left and of the right, particularly at both extremes. And there are plenty of people at both extremes in the United States. at this time. As we said, I think it's quantifiable through social scientists, political scientists, that there's increasing polarization on the political spectrum in the United States, increasing numbers of people who identify with one extreme or the other, as opposed to the historical trend where we had a lot of independence. It was a very proud tradition, particularly in the Midwest, of being independent and going with one party or the other, depending on how you felt about certain candidates or certain issues that were, at that time, very important. So the question then is, has fake news had a great influence? And I would argue that it's really had a corrosive effect, using this term. There are many situations. So here's an apolitical situation, in my opinion, that we did an article or a series of articles about Chicago food trucks, which are mobile restaurants essentially, and their lack of complying with regulations, cleanliness, and such things. I won't bore you with the details of those stories, but it got a very strong reaction in Chicago. We worked with the local affiliate of the ABC network to publish this, and so of course one of the food trucks used its Twitter handle to say #fake news, and here are the actual facts. And again, here they're just using the term fake news because they don't agree with what we wrote. And like I said, it's happening from the right and from the left. Any inconvenient truth is immediately labeled as fake news. So how corrosive is this effect? And how much is it being used against real news that they just don't like, as opposed to truly false or sensational information that's disseminated under the guise of news reporting? I think in many cases it's being directed against pure news reporting, which is, and so one of the most interesting comments, there are many things about Barack Obama, who I knew personally before he became a presidential candidate or even a senator, because he's from Chicago, of course. But I don't agree with everything that he's done, obviously, as president. But he says, recently some very, very interesting comments about how social media is affected by the phenomenon of people declaring fake news against whoever they disagree with. Let me find it here. I thought some of the most interesting comments were to the effect of, if we're not serious about facts and what's true and what's not true, and if we can't discriminate between serious arguments and propaganda, then we have problems. He said that there is very much active misinformation that is packaged very well and looks like it is fake. And so we have a lot of people in the U.S. society right now that just will dismiss things if they come from one news media source or another automatically. So I think we've moved beyond healthy skepticism into a sort of cynicism that assumes that everyone is biased to an extent that is automatic, for the right, for the left. I think as Shula spoke before me, there are a lot of people on the right that assume that public media is to the left because although many of the stations are in rural areas and in small towns, sometimes it's associated with the elitism of the urban centers, maybe on the East Coast and the West Coast particularly, which are more liberal areas politically. What we've seen locally is, and so people turn now in many cases to news sources which, well, I use the term news sources lightly for them, people like Breitbart. And now that they have a president in there that they wanted, they're sort of at war with one another all of a sudden because the president maybe doesn't do everything that they had hoped he would do. And so you see how conflicted they are about reporting the news, because they're not trying to just report the news and let the chips fall where they may. They're trying to decide what this means for them politically. And this is something that I don't feel at all shackled by. I don't feel burdened by having to report the news for one party or the other. What we try to do in many cases, from our perspective, is follow the stories where they take us, be they about Democrats, be they about Republicans. With all due respect to everyone, one of my favorite praise that I got from someone that I wrote about, it was a Mexican-American politician in Chicago, a member of our local council. First I had written about him, and this was before the term fake news, so he fortunately didn't call me fake news. But when I wrote about him, of course, he didn't like it. And then when I wrote about someone that he doesn't like, he came up to me and he said, "You know what, I used to think that you were against me, but now I see," and he used a term in Spanish that I won't translate it into English even, but he said, "You're an equal opportunity chingon," which means you'll basically do that to anybody, regardless of parties. And that's what we aim for, frankly, is to be equal opportunity in terms of we follow the truth. If anybody knows Spanish here, they know why I didn't change it into English. It's a very Mexican term, actually. Maybe even some of the Spanish staff of the hotel don't know that term. But it basically refers to our tendency to try to be independent, truly independent of partisan politics. And of course, that becomes more and more difficult every day in this country. People will, on a personal level, I think very savvy readers are familiar with the fact that I've done stories about Democrats, about Republicans, about the mayor, about his opponents, because I work mostly in the local sphere. But there are readers who will absolutely jump on you and say that if you write about one side, then you must be a tool of the other side. And then, of course, they'll disregard things that you wrote in the other direction very recently. And I've just noticed that's much more common than it was when I began my career in the late 90s, actually in St. Louis, before moving back to Chicago, which is my hometown. So let me tell you a little bit about how some of this, well, I don't want to call it fake news because I don't want to engage in the same name calling that they engage in, but let's talk about some biased or clearly biased news sources. We know about them on the national level, such as Breitbart, or I think InfoWars is another one of the websites that has a truly unhinged individual leading it. But when we talk about the local level, the same thing is happening locally. It was very interesting this morning to hear about the challenges of local news in some parts of Russia that are far to the east of Moscow, in my understanding of the geography of Russia, which I unfortunately have not visited before. But you have a situation locally where the same sort of phenomenon are happening. We live in a federal republic, right? In the United States, it's very decentralized. And so Trump is sucking up a lot of the oxygen and taking a lot of the attention and overshadowing what's going on. But we really believe in the United States, a truism since the early days of our republic, that all politics is local, ultimately. And in this case, they try to influence the politics locally because great policy decisions, important policy decisions, are made at the state level. Shula talked about the state of Illinois with the governor and the homes for the veterans that the state government of Illinois oversees. City government has a great influence. Someone mentioned in Yaroslav that the snow removal is the responsibility of the mayor, and it's the same thing in Chicago. Since there was a huge storm in the late 70s that was not cleaned up adequately right before Election Day, there is a great deal of attention to snow removal and the political implications of that. And that's something that touches people very directly. You know, it can take them many hours to get home from work if the snow is not removed in a city like Chicago, where it snows more than it does in Iceland. So let me show you a little bit about what they do locally to try to influence the situation. This is this is a joint project that we did just recently. We at the Sun-Times, the Watchdogs team, which I'm part of as the investigative reporting team, we did a joint investigation with ProPublica Illinois, which is one of these new nonprofit news organizations that's dedicated to doing truly independent and unbiased journalism. We found out that they had set up something that would investigate corruption on the local level, and it said that it was going to be independent and nonpartisan. But this Illinois Policy Institute, you see, it has a very basic name. It doesn't say, you know, Illinois Right Wing Institute, but turns out that 98% of its money came from, and 98% of this investigation group, this independent city investigator, 98% of his budget, we found out from public records, came from a right-wing group that is funded entirely by a small group of billionaires, I would say would-be oligarchs, because they wish to have the sort of influence, and they're envious of the sort of influence that some of your oligarchs probably have. The Koch brothers, their billionaire industrialist brothers, the Mercers and other families fund these organizations and funnel the money into local groups that I think pose as journalistic groups. And the reason that I know that they're not really journalistic groups, in my opinion, again, I won't call them fake news, but they are clearly biased, is, you know, when we write a story about a Democrat and these right-wing groups don't like that Democrat, they'll take our stories and they'll hold it up as if this is great journalism. They'll link to it. They'll say this is fantastic. When we write about one of their friends, suddenly we are fake news. Suddenly we're not credible and we're not to be trusted. So they trust us when we write about their enemies. They don't trust us and tell people not to trust us when we write about their friends. One other thing I wanted to close with before I want to open it up to questions. I have a handout, actually. Let me switch here. I don't know if anyone can help me out. So what do we do then? Shula talked about the need to be, Joseph Pulitzer's statement to be never belong to any party and always fight demagoguery of all parties or corruption of all parties. That was actually my former newspaper, the Post-Dispatch. That's their platform of that newspaper, which was funded by Joseph Pulitzer, the family that gave us the Pulitzer Prizes. Another one that I like to, thanks Russ, thank you so much. Actually, there's an English version I need to hold on to. Sorry. The rest of them are in Russian. The rest of them are in Russian. Yeah. For some reason, this handout I'm going to give you is 3 pages in Russian and only 2 pages in English. But you guys might, I can't really say how it's different. It says it's a direct translation. Unfortunately, I don't speak Russian. But one of my favorite mottos, we talk about the Post-Dispatch platform. We also have the journalist's creed from my alma mater. I went to the University of Missouri School of Journalism, which is the first journalism school in the world, I believe. And it's a journalism school in Columbia, Missouri, about 2 hours from St. Louis. It's been there since, I think, 1907, 1908. They just had their centennial. And they talk about the journalist's creed, which is kind of like a Hippocratic oath for us in journalism, and that also focuses on being stoutly independent, meaning we go where the facts take us, and we go with a skeptical attitude, but I think not a cynical attitude. We don't assume bad motivations or bad actions by the people that we cover, but we ask them to back up what they're doing. And so that leads me into the how we get facts in the fake news era, and some of the institutional sort of setups that we have which help us to do our job. I was very encouraged today to hear about the Freedom of Information Act laws in Russia, and I'm not familiar with the landscape in many countries, but I can't imagine doing what we do in the United States without the Freedom of Information Act. Sure, we have people leak us documents, and I should probably get encrypted email, actually, and a PGP key. But they find us, and we meet with them sometimes in person, and they hand us documents. We meet with them. Sometimes they send things anonymously by email. But I think more often than not, we don't have sources in that sense who are leakers or who are really sources. I would consider them more to be tipsters, and that they're people that anonymously contact us or ask for anonymity from us, speak with us confidentially, give us some tips about what we're going to do or what we should do and what's really going on. And then it's my job to try to figure out how I can prove it. They don't usually come with it completely gift wrapped and in a form that we can go straight to the paper. I mean, you see that in the movies, of course, but the reality, as we all know, I think, is that you have to get the documentation to back up what you're hearing. And sometimes I act on tips, sometimes I act on my own curiosity. You know, I knew someone that got a massive grant of $98 million and kind of knew who his friends were, and went about finding the documents to show how the grant was spent. They did have to make some reports to the state. They were building privately run schools, what we call charter schools, and that was not a tip. Many people had different theories about who tipped me off, but the truth is nobody tipped me off in that case. There was no source to protect per se. What I did was I had some curiosity how the money was being spent, and as we say in English, we followed the money. And we saw that he gave all the contracts to his friends and his brothers, and that led to a scandal, and people lost jobs that paid them $250,000 and $300,000 a year. Several people, I added up all the salaries of all the people who had to resign, and it was well over $1 million a year. There was investigations by federal authorities like the Securities and Exchange Commission. So we have to go about pursuing the facts, whether, again, by our own volition, our own curiosity, our own suspicion or skepticism, and also from tipsters. So here is a list of some of the things that I find most useful in many cases. I don't have to go, I can go into as much detail or as little detail as you guys want. What I've learned here this week, and also from your visits to Chicago, is that you have so many good questions, and not just questions. I kind of like that a lot of the questions here are prefaced by almost sort of speeches and sharing of personal experiences. So I know I don't have to encourage you to do that. I just need to allow enough time for that, I think. And I think we will have enough time. So I can just go through a little bit of this right now, or we can go directly to the questions. But the fundamental thing that underpins all of these documents is, of course, the idea of transparency in government, and what do we have to ensure transparency in government? Because everybody that comes in is a reformer, and everybody promises to be transparent, and then once they are the ones that have to be transparent, they don't see the same need for transparency anymore, right? I mean, we see that all the time. It's just human nature. And so I'm sure that it happens in Russia as well as in the United States. But in the United States, we do have some institutional setups that require transparency, that force transparency on the part of public officials. And really the most important tool that we have is the Freedom of Information Act. We call it in Illinois the Sunshine Law, because the metaphor is that everything can be disinfected if it's exposed to sunlight. And so if you are able to scrutinize the actions and the spending of your public officials and the correspondences that they exchange as they're forming these decisions, then maybe you are able to discourage corruption. Hasn't exactly worked out that way in Illinois. We've had 2 governors in a row go to prison. We had 2 heads of our Chicago public school system in a row resign under scandal. One is in prison. The other one quit after an internal investigator for the school district called for his resignation. That investigation started with a story that I and another colleague did where we questioned, typical situation that I'm sure you see in Russia, an insider deal. He gave a contract to people that he used to work with and went to great lengths to get around different ethics rules. And when we questioned that, it started an investigation. So, of course, the fact that you can be exposed does not discourage everyone from doing these things. But we do feel that perhaps it would happen more often if we didn't have a vibrant free press that was willing to go after wrongdoing in either or any party. Either party in the U.S., I say, because there are two major parties, but any party or anybody. And we have a lot of things available to us that politicians just have to give us. In Illinois, we have what they call statement of financial interests, where they have to disclose gifts that they get, trips that they get. I learned that the Speaker of the Illinois House and his wife had gone on 4 or 5 trips to Turkey and found pictures of them wearing fezes. And they were guests of, well, it said on their Niagara Foundation, but we traced it back to somebody that you've probably heard of named Fethullah Gulen. And he's someone in Turkey that was and no longer is close to President Erdogan, but as you probably know, he's been mixed up with all of these intrigues since the president took over, President Trump last year. So we are able to use these documents to show really significant things. And of course, if they lie on these documents and we find out that they've lied, and then it's all the more worse for them. So they tend to fill these forms out honestly and hope that we don't connect the dots that they've and pick up the crumbs that they've left for us on this trail. There's campaign finance disclosure, which is really, really aggressive, and again, it's up to them to be honest about it. But within 48 hours, they have to disclose any large contribution in Illinois. I think more than $500. Countless stories are able to link these contributions with official actions and point out conflicts of interest. Of course, they give money in different names. Sometimes their spouse gives money. Sometimes they have 10 different, 20 different, 30 different company names. But of course, it's our job to then figure that out. Emails have become extremely valuable to us, even though we've done many, many stories based on emails that have made politicians look bad or exposed hidden agendas. They continue to use, it's just, again, human nature in this digital age. People just still say stupid things in email. They just can't help, we can't help ourselves, right? So Freedom of Information Act allows you to get these things. And I could go on, like I said, about all the different forms of documentation that we get, but I'll skip ahead to the institution that we have in Illinois called Public Access Counselor. And so about 10 years ago, there was a reform of the Freedom of Information law of Illinois. A couple things happened. One of them, they decreased the time required for a response. It used to be 7 business days, and now it's 5 business days. And they also created something, an office of the state attorney general called of the state's top legal officer called the Public Access Counselor, where journalists or regular people, bloggers don't often avail themselves of that because many of them just like to write what they want to write, and they expect us to make the phone calls and the Freedom of Information Act requests. That's what I find in general, but not always, of course. But many people can go to this Public Access Counselor, and they can seek to find intervention on their behalf if one of the government agencies, be they schools, which are taxpayer-funded bodies, be they municipal governments or the state government itself, if they don't comply with your request within the time frame of 5 business days, that's automatically a denial of your request. There are other times when they deny you, citing various exemptions. There are exemptions for some pending real estate matters or for privacy matters. Sometimes I'll get documents and people's phone numbers or home addresses or social security numbers will be deleted. But oftentimes these exemptions are construed much more broadly than they need to be by the public officials for the purpose of purposely stonewalling the investigation of journalists and for the purpose of covering their own, behinds and protecting themselves from being scrutinized as much as they should be. So we can appeal to the public access counselor, and there are cases where the state has sided with me. For instance, in a case against that school that I mentioned that was giving contracts to the siblings of their high officials, that was spending money on trips to some exotic locations. By the way, this was a school that served 95% low-income poor students that qualified for free lunch. And they were paying themselves hundreds of thousands of dollars going on trips to very exotic locations, all in the name of expanding their schools. And we had to go and pursue a case with the public access counselor. Unfortunately, there are weaknesses in our law that, for instance, the public access counselor ruled in our favor, but they decided, even though it was a binding arbitration, that they wouldn't comply, that they would sue me, the newspaper, and the public access counselor in the court system. And that's when our lawyers got involved. And really, one of the great aspects of our freedom of information law is that if you do involve a lawyer, and we are increasingly doing this, not just us, but other newspapers in Illinois, if you sue the city or the state government, instead of going to the public access counselor, you just go directly into the civil court system, into the state court system, and you sue them for this violation of the Freedom of Information Act, and you win, then they have to pay your lawyer's legal fees. So your lawyer, if he thinks you have a strong case, and we have such a lawyer, will take our cases and we'll win, and then he'll get paid by the taxpayers. And unfortunately, the politicians don't care because it's not their money. They're happy to spend your money to delay their reckoning day, to delay their exposure to whatever negative news, negative information about them that you're pursuing. But it's still something that can be effective to ultimately get the truth. Again, it's the legal system, so it takes a while, takes too long, in my opinion. But sometimes it works faster than other times, and this is what we've been able to do at our newspaper to do things like that. I want to just show you a little bit about my newspaper here. We have, whoops, sorry, that's my editor's email. He says he's not going to bother me anymore in London, and I don't believe, in England, I mean, but I don't believe that at all, because you know how editors can be. They need something always, and they can't do anything for themselves too often. But we have a number of stories that I wanted to show you here. Yeah, one was, this is Paul Saltzman. Let me find it. 1 second. Some recent front pages. Actually, it's from myself. Some recent front pages from our newspaper that I want to share with you. Just so that you know, I work for basically, you can see from the format here, I work for a tabloid newspaper. I don't want it to be confused with the Fleet Street tabloids precisely. We have some interesting headlines, yes, on our front page. You know, not so independent watchdog. There's a better one that I have. Again, it's slightly profane, I'm afraid. Where we did write about a politician. We exposed that he was getting a special snow plowing service. That was one of my favorite headlines. So we have these headlines that we do which sometimes play off of puns. But other than that, we really do the same sort of journalism as broadsheet newspapers. But there are quite a few tabloids left in the United States, which are city newspapers, city tabloids. New York Daily News is another one that you may have heard of. It's sort of in a similar vein. In fact, our editor is now the editor. Our former editor is now the editor of the New York Daily News. But let me try to find this one for you, and then we'll open it up to questions here. What did I do with it? It was in my email, sorry. Let me find it here. Well, maybe I'll find it in a minute here. But basically, like I said, it was about snow removal. There was a very powerful elected official. He has a very big house on a not very busy street. The city's mayor, in an abundance of, remember, transparency, decided that he was going to put GPS devices on all the snowplows. You might find this interesting in Yaroslav and other places where it snows a lot. Our mayor put these GPS tracking devices, and they put the data in real time so that nobody could complain, because they could see that the truck was coming to their street on a website. I think it's called ChicagoSnowTracker.org or something to that effect. We asked for the data, historical data, not just the live data, and we analyzed it, and we found that this one very powerful Alderman street was clean, even though it was a side street, almost a dead-end street, was cleaned 14 times during one 21-inch, like 50-centimeter snowfall, 14 times before much bigger Main Street was cleaned. Their first excuse was that even though it's on a side street, it's on a main route. We did a Freedom of Information Act request for their route book, which they give to the drivers, and of course his house is a mile from the nearest route. And then after we exposed it, he actually did it again the next time it snowed a lot. And so our headline was Snowballs, which refers to not only the snowballs that you make to throw, but also, you know, another kind of round thing that he had in abundance if he's repeating this behavior despite being exposed. And eventually there was an investigation of that, and now everybody makes sure to send me tweets telling me that he's not been plowed again until everybody else, that it's more deserving. For instance, hospitals and the airport, those places are cleaned before his street now, much to his chagrin, I'm sure. So, yeah, I've been talked too long, or longer than I intended, I think. So I would like to just open it up to questions. I hope that we can talk either about fake news or about the ways that that term is used, or we can talk about how we get facts as opposed to fake news, or anything else that you want to talk about.